Hi there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, and we're going to begin at the United Nations, where President Trump addressed the annual gathering of world leaders, touting his administration's accomplishments and what he called the, quote, golden age of America, while laying out a list of grievances about the UN and many traditional U.S. allies, including the handling of foreign wars, immigration, and climate change. Today was President Trump's first time addressing the UN General Assembly since returning to the White House. In a speech that lasted nearly an hour, the president started by questioning the mission of the UN.
I ended 7 wars, and in all cases, they were raging with countless thousands of people being killed. What is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous, tremendous potential. But it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war. The only thing that solves war and wars is action.
This all comes as ceasefire deals to end the wars in the Mideast and Ukraine continue to elude the president. President Trump once again putting pressure on Hamas to end the war in Gaza, accusing Hamas of repeatedly rejecting reasonable offers to make peace, while also criticizing U.S. allies, including Canada, the U.K., Australia, and France, who broke with the U.S. and announced they will formally recognize a Palestinian state.
Now, as if to encourage continued conflict, some of this body is seeking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities. But instead of giving in to Hamas's ransom demands, those who want peace should be united with one message: release the hostages now. Just release the hostages now.
And on the conflict in Ukraine, President Trump reiterated his threat to impose major consequences on Russia if it doesn't end the war, but only if U.S. partners in Europe agreed to follow suit.
Inexcusably, even NATO countries have not cut off much Russian energy and Russian energy products, which, as you know, I found out about 2 weeks ago, and I wasn't happy. Think of it. They're funding the war against themselves. Who the hell ever heard of that one? In the event that Russia is not ready to make a deal to end the war, then the United States is fully prepared to impose a very strong round of powerful tariffs, which would stop the bloodshed, I believe, very quickly. But for those tariffs to be effective, European nations, all of you are gathered here right now, would have to join us in adopting the exact same measures.
Now, during a meeting on the sidelines of the General Assembly, President Zelensky said that he supports President Trump's call for Europe to stop buying Russian oil and gas and emphasized the needs for sanctions on Moscow. Following that meeting, President Trump appeared to dramatically shift his posture on Ukraine's ability to win the war. Posting on social media, "I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option." It also comes after the president said that NATO should take on offensive posture toward recent Russian incursion into its airspace. Take a listen.
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
Would you back them up? Would the United States help them out in some way?
Depends on the circumstance, but, we're very strong toward NATO.
Seems to be quite the shift from the president. Let's talk about it now. Joining me, NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hillyard. He's outside the UN building. Also with me is NBC News Chief Washington correspondent and Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell, and Evelyn Farkas, the executive director of the McCain Institute and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. So, Vaughn, give me your biggest takeaways from the president's speech to the UN today.
There is definitely the American nationalist element here, that the president boasting about the success of the United States, suggesting that he had effectively secured the United States border, and that history has shown that he is, quote, right about everything, and that other countries should do more to listen to him when it comes to migration, when it comes to energy policy, when it comes to military might and investments in military defenses. This was a president of the United States that struck a different chord than he did even 5 years ago when he was promoting the idea of America first and peace through strength. In this moment, the president of the United States making it very clear here that the United States is going to work with individuals who he likes. He said as much here. And this was one there when talking about migration. It was very much of a nativist argument that he was making, that America needs to defend Americans and that the other countries' troubles should stay in those countries and be solved by those countries and not create new problems, in his words, inside of the U.S. or other countries' borders. I want to let you listen to a little bit more of him talking about migration.
Not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the #1 political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined. It's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. Let's see, I can tell you. I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell.
He went on to question what the purpose of the United Nations is, saying that they have much greater potential than they are currently being used for. At the same time, it's his administration that has cut more than $500 million in funding to the UN in the first 7 months of this administration. Of course, he has also cut humanitarian and international aid, as well as shuttered USAID. His administration has been very defensive of those cuts. And as you heard the president there in his nearly hour-long remarks, urge other countries to take on more responsibility for what happens in only within their own borders, but within their regions.
But Vaughn, at the same time that he gave a speech that certainly had a nationalist streak to it, he also seemed to change his tone when it came to Ukraine. Talk us through that. What led to that?
Over the course of just a couple hours, he changed his tune. During his actual remarks, he suggested what he has for the better part of 5 months now, that Russia needed to end its war and enter into a ceasefire or face the threat of additional sanctions. But he did not announce in front of this General Assembly any new sanctions or secondary sanctions on China, for instance. Instead, you have watched this deadline that he had imposed on Russia repeatedly to end its war continue to come and go. And yet, over the course of just the last 2 hours, you then saw him sit there next to President Zelensky and suggest that the U.S. would back the invoking of Article 5 if a NATO country were to face further Russian aircraft incursions, as Romania, Estonia, and Poland have all reported in the last 2 weeks. There's a question about aircraft's drones that shut down the Copenhagen airport today and whether those were Russian-controlled here. And so the president suggesting that he would back the shooting down of Russian aircraft, which even caused Zelensky to turn his head and look at the American president. And then after that meeting, in that social media post, President Trump doing a complete 180 on what he had said from what he had said in early August, when he had suggested that Zelensky was going to have to agree to, quote, land swap with Russia in order to get to an end to the war. Here today now openly suggesting that there is the potential that with continued financing and military equipment, that Ukraine has the potential of taking back the land that Russia has seized. And so we have still not heard the U.S. president suggest he is going to help finance that effort or provide new military equipment to back that effort, that offensive effort here, nor did he announce those additional sanctions on Russia at the same time. This is quite a stark trajectory from where the president was, not just back in February, but even where he was a month and a half ago as he welcomed Vladimir Putin onto the U.S. soil.
And also pretty very much out of line with his general America First policy, which in many ways was born out of the conflict in Ukraine, at least for his base. How could the president's base respond to what they heard today? Obviously, they're probably very happy with this speech, but the remarks and the social media posts about Ukraine have to rankle some of his most diehard supporters.
Right, and I think that is where there is the question about how exactly they respond. We have heard people like Marjorie Taylor Greene say she doesn't care what happens in Ukraine, and now suddenly the American president is suggesting that the U.S. could back further efforts. And of course, these would not be short-term efforts. These would undoubtedly take mass amounts of military assets and financial commitment from the United States. And when the president said that he wants to see more from Europe when it comes to cutting off Russian oil and gas purchases completely, we should note that over the last 4 years, there has been a major drop. But one of the biggest buyers that remains out of Europe of Russian oil and gas is Hungary, which has now been a political ally, Viktor Orban, of President Trump. And he was asked whether he would have that conversation with Viktor Orban, and he said he would. And so I think this really calls into question. This was just a few hours that we have heard the president, but will he actually change his tenor on this over a prolonged period of time? That will only be seen over the course of weeks here. But I think this is statements that are very much welcomed by the Ukrainian delegation here in New York City, and one that the Russian delegation, I think, was definitely going to be having conversations about the seriousness to which the president is willing to back up the words that he is speaking here in New York.
Yeah. All right. So, Evan, let's get you to weigh in on this, because it's hard to believe that just a few months ago, the president and the vice president were openly fighting with Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office. Now we have this dramatic shift tone, basically the president endorsing what Ukraine's goals are in this war to get its original territory back. Just how significant is this shift?
Well, it's interesting to me. I don't know how significant it is, Ryan, because as you pointed out, and others have pointed out, the assistance spigot, the military assistance to Ukraine, has not been turned on. And President Trump has basically said, well, the Europeans have to go first when it comes to sanctions, which, is not really what most of us who want Ukraine to prevail are calling for. We would like U.S. assistance right now on the military front and sanctions against Russia right now. But I think what might be happening is, remember, it looks like there was about an hour meeting with the two presidents, President Zelensky and President Trump. Also, remember, Mike Waltz is now there as UN ambassador, a man with a lot of military background and experience when it comes to national security issues. President Trump may be getting some briefings on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and what's happening behind the enemy lines or the line of contact inside Russia. And what I'm getting at is that Russia's not doing well militarily, and Ukraine's actually been taking some ground back in that area near Kursk, where they were kicked out by the North Koreans, and that the Ukrainian strikes against the Russian oil facilities have been really clever, and they've actually hit some refineries that the Russians would not be able to get up quickly. And so it's either happening now or in the future. There could be shortages that would impact the Russians, and President Trump alluded to that as well in his Truth Social post.
Well, let's also talk about just Russia's posture in Europe generally. The president also said that NATO should shoot down Russian aircrafts that enter its airspace. That would be a dramatic change in the posture up until this point. Do you agree? And what could the consequences be if Poland, for instance, shot down these drones that have been making it over the border?
Yeah, I mean, Ryan, that one I consider dramatic because it's backing up Article 5, which is to say deterrence, trying to stop Russia from continuing these, frankly, attacks. These incursions, we're calling them. But, if something had been hit, it would be an attack on the territory of Poland, Romania, and maybe Denmark, and Estonia, of course. So what we're trying to do is reestablish deterrence, because clearly it's not working. Russia keeps doing it. And President Trump was helpful in this respect. He was saying, NATO allies, we need to come to the defense of any ally that's attacked in this way. And Russia should expect to have its aircraft shot down.
Okay, let's bring Andrea into the conversation now. Andrea, talk to us a little bit about the status of diplomatic efforts to end the war between Israel and Hamas, which is another thing that President Trump touched on in his speech. Is the decision by some Western leaders to recognize a Palestinian state having any impact at all on the decisions Israel's making?
Well, if anything, it is reaffirming and strengthening Israel's resolve to expand and continue the war against Hamas, the war in Gaza City. And with that, he has complete U.S. support. So it has isolated the U.S. and Israel, causing, diplomatic isolation, political fallout from that. But it is basically symbolic. All of the leaders involved, starting with Macron and certainly Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, and Starmer, know that this is condition-based. This is conditioned on a ceasefire, an end of the war, a Palestinian election, new Palestinian leadership, security agreements provided by an Arab coalition. So there are so many steps. And before all those steps, they have to make sure that Israel doesn't annex the West Bank and carry through its approved threat to take that last piece between North and South and cut up the West Bank so that there would be no Palestinian state. That makes it impossible to have a contiguous territory. And that is a very definite threat that Netanyahu is going to be bringing here when he comes at the end of this week. And he does not yet have a green light from the U.S. for that. But let me just weigh in for just a moment, because I've covered the Ukraine war, and our press corps is sending me notes from what Zelensky said afterwards. He is now describing this as a game changer. This is the very first time on Truth Social that the president has gone online and said that Ukraine can regain all of its territory, regain the territory that he's been fighting for since Russia invaded. And what Zelensky said just now plays right into what Evelyn, who knows this area so well, and who's been with all of us in Munich every year watching the evolution of the Zelensky-U.S. relationship, and how Zelensky warned us 2 years ago that with Advika, on that horrible trip, frankly, that they were going to begin to have to retreat. I was covering him then, and he said, if you don't help, this was when the U.S. had cut off aid to Ukraine, waiting for the supplemental. Lindsey Graham wasn't there, as he usually led that delegation, and all this at the behest of Donald Trump, not even president yet. And then, of course, the president coming up with this arrangement where he provides the U.S. weapons to NATO, but not the weapons directly to Ukraine, and is not providing new shipments. But Zelensky is saying that this is a game changer. It's the first time that Donald Trump has said this. Now, what's interesting about shooting down, invoking Article 5 and shooting down drones or even MiGs now in Denmark, reportedly today, and this is, of course, after Estonia, Romania, and Poland were all had incursions from Russian drones into their airspace, and where there was an Emergency Security Council meeting yesterday morning on this very subject, and a passionate speech by the Polish foreign minister. But what Marco Rubio said on morning television today when asked this very question was, well, it's not a big deal, the Russian planes. We send them away in Alaska all the time. So the president has changed positions on shooting down or fighting back against Russian incursions since his national security advisor and Secretary of State was speaking just this morning at 7 a.m. and live on television. The evolution of Donald Trump at these photo ops, but this is the first time he has had a really positive meeting with Zelensky, certainly the first time since the Alaska summit. And it's clear that Putin is really wearing out his welcome. One other thing, Vaughn mentioned Hungary. It's Hungary and Slovakia. When the president says that Europe should stop buying, that requires the entire EU to unanimously agree to something, and the Russian allies, who are his, MAGA supporters, and of course the Hungarian president shows up at CPAC meetings in Washington and Florida. That's not going to happen anytime soon.
And then finally, quickly, Andrea, President Trump also attending a meeting with some Arab leaders. What do we expect would come out of that?
Well, certainly at that meeting, they're going to be talking about Gaza. They're going to be talking about the Israeli strike against Qatar, but talking about also the future of Gaza. And implicit in a lot of this is what Trump laid out to Netanyahu's surprise in February in an Oval Office meeting, when he first disclosed that they were thinking about displacing the Palestinians eventually and rebuilding Gaza with Arab and other private sector money. And that is not off the table. And that is considered by much of the world ethnic cleansing, and it is to the horror of Egypt and Jordan, who are neighbors, of course, to Gaza, and don't want to see that happen because that's a refugee crisis for them.
Okay, Andrea Mitchell on top of all of it for us, as always. Andrea, we appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.